On a Tuesday morning in September of 1996, Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the Cedar River and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days earlier, his company's newest excavator, a Caterpillar 330, $450,000 of hydraulic precision and computerized control, had broken through what the site engineers promised was solid ground. The machine had dropped like a stone, its 60-ton weight punching through a thin crust of dried clay into bottomless river muck beneath. Now the excavator sat in the riverbank like a dying dinosaur, buried past its tracks, its yellow paint streaked with black mud, its cab tilted at a 30-degree angle. Every hour it seemed to sink another inch deeper. Marcus had tried everything. On the first day, he'd brought in two Peterbilt 379 recovery trucks from his fleet, modern machines with computer-controlled PTO winches rated for 50 tons each. They'd pulled until their own rear duals started to sink, until the winch cables screamed and warning lights lit up the dashboards. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. On the second day, he'd called Midwest Heavy Recovery out of Des Moines, specialists in impossible extractions. They'd brought a twin-boom wrecker with hydraulic outriggers and enough pulling power to move a house. They'd rigged it 6 different ways. After 6 hours, they'd packed up and left, saying the angle was wrong and the suction was too strong. On the third day, Marcus called his insurance company. They told him what he already knew. Operator error driving onto unstable ground wasn't covered. He was looking at a total loss of the excavator plus penalties for missing the bridge construction deadline. That's when the old Ford F600 pulled up to the site. Let me tell you about Frank Kowalski, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Frank was 71 years old and had been in the towing business for 48 years. He'd started in 1948, the year he got back from the Pacific, working for his uncle's wrecker service in Cedar Rapids. By 1955, he'd saved enough to buy his own truck. By 1960, he was running a 3-truck operation. Frank had pulled cars out of ditches, semis out of snowbanks, tractors out of fields, and once, in 1973, a school bus out of a frozen pond. He'd done it all with manual winches, steel cable, and an understanding of physics that came from doing, not studying. He'd retired in 1994 at 69, selling his business to a corporate recovery chain. Kept one truck for himself. Not his newest truck, not his biggest. The 1949 Holmes 440 wrecker he'd bought at a barn estate sale in 1978 for $800. The Holmes was ancient even then. Built in Chattanooga in 1949, it was a post-war medium-duty wrecker mounted on a Dodge chassis. The boom was all manual, no hydraulics, just cable and pulleys and a hand crank. The truck had maybe 80 horsepower. It weighed about 8,000 pounds. Frank had restored it over 2 years, not because he needed another wrecker, but because something about the Holmes reminded him of why he'd gotten into the business. Simple, honest, built to pull. Now he kept it in his barn, fired it up once a month, took it to county fair tractor pulls and vintage truck shows. He was done with the business, done with the stress, done with the phone ringing at 3 a.m. But he still listened to his scanner, old habits. That's how he heard about the excavator. Marcus Webb looked up from his clipboard when the old Ford F600 pulled onto the construction site. The truck was weathered, faded red and white paint, rounded 1950s cab, exhaust stack showing surface rust. Behind it, towed on a small trailer, was the Holmes wrecker. Marcus walked over as an old man climbed down from the truck, coveralls that had seen better decades, work boots with the toes scuffed white, canvas jacket, flat cap. "Site's closed," Marcus said, not rudely but firmly. "Insurance liability." "I'm not a visitor," Frank said. "I'm someone who can help." Marcus looked at the old man, looked at the ancient wrecker on the trailer, looked back at his $450,000 excavator sinking into the river mud. Help out. I can pull that excavator out. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Marcus started to laugh. Not meanly. He was just tired and stressed, and the idea of this old man and his museum piece wrecker solving a problem that had defeated modern recovery specialists was too absurd. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but that excavator weighs 60 tons. We've had 2 modern recovery trucks and a specialist crew try for 2 days. What makes you think? I heard the problem on the scanner, Frank interrupted. Excavator broke through clay crust into river mud, sunk past the tracks, suction holding it. That about right? That's right. Your modern trucks pull straight back. Hydraulic winches, computer-controlled. They sense resistance and back off to protect the equipment. That's correct. That's your problem, Frank said. You're not fighting the weight, you're fighting suction. Suction doesn't respond to steady pull, it responds to shock load. You need to break the seal, not drag it. Marcus stared at him. And you can do that with a 1949 wrecker. Done it before. Different vehicles, same physics. Suction is suction. One of the site engineers had walked over during the conversation. His name was David Chen, 34, civil engineering degree from Iowa State, calculator always in his pocket. Sir, David said, trying to be respectful, we've calculated the forces involved. To break suction on a 60-ton excavator buried 12 feet deep in saturated clay, you'd need an initial pull force of at least 85 tons, followed by sustained pull of 60 plus. That wrecker, he pointed at the homes, was rated for maybe 15 tons when it was new, in 1949. Your calculator tell you about shock load? Frank asked. Shock load is irrelevant when you don't have the base pulling capacity. Frank looked at the engineer, then at Marcus, then at the excavator slowly sinking in the distance. I'm not charging you anything, Frank said. If it doesn't work, you've lost an afternoon. If it does work, you save $500,000 and your contract deadline. What have you got to lose? Marcus looked at his watch. He looked at his excavator. He looked at his engineer, who shrugged. Fine, Marcus said. Show me what a 47-year-old wrecker can do. Let me tell you about the Holmes 440, because it's important to understand why this particular wrecker could do what modern equipment couldn't. The Holmes 440 was built in an era when pulling vehicles meant understanding leverage, not programming computers. The boom was a simple A-frame design, manually operated with a hand crank reduction gear. The main winch was cable-driven, running through a series of pulleys that multiplied force through mechanical advantage. But the key feature, the thing that made the Holmes different from modern hydraulic wreckers, was the snatch block system. Modern wreckers use hydraulic winches that apply steady, controlled pressure. They're designed to protect themselves. When resistance exceeds a threshold, they automatically reduce power or stop entirely. This prevents equipment damage. It also means they can't generate shock load. The Holmes used a manual hand crank and a free spool cable drum. An operator could build tension slowly, then release the brake and let momentum and gravity create a sudden jerk. A shock load that could break things loose that steady pulling couldn't touch. It was dangerous if you didn't know what you were doing. The cable could snap, the truck could flip, the load could break free too fast and cause damage. But if you knew what you were doing, if you understood angles and tension and timing, you could generate pulling forces that exceeded the wrecker's rated capacity by a factor of 3 or 4. Frank knew what he was doing. It took Frank 2 hours to set up. He didn't rush. He unloaded the Holmes from the trailer, started the old Dodge engine, and drove the wrecker as close to the excavator as he dared, about 50 feet from the edge where the ground was still solid. Then he walked to the excavator, wading through mud up to his knees, carrying 100 feet of heavy chain. Not cable, chain. The same chain his uncle had used in the 1940s. Marcus and David Watch from solid ground. Why chain instead of cable? David asked. Chain stretches, Frank called back. Cable doesn't. When you're generating shock load, you want some elasticity in the system. Stores energy, releases it gradually. Cable snaps clean when it hits its limit. Frank hooked the chain to the excavator's frame at a specific point. Not the bucket, not the boom, but the main chassis frame low and centered. Then he walked the chain back to the homes, threading it through a series of snatch blocks he'd positioned at intervals. Each block changed the angle of pull and multiplied the mechanical advantage. By the time he was finished, that 100 feet of chain ran through 6 different pulleys, creating a compound leverage system that would multiply the home's pulling force by a factor of 6. David pulled out his calculator and started running numbers. His expression changed from skepticism to confusion to something like respect. If the leverage ratio is really 6-to-1, David said slowly, and the homes can generate even 15 tons of initial pull, that's 90 tons of force at the load point. Math works, Frank said, cranking the home's boom into position. But the shock load when you release, David stopped. You could snap the chain or flip your truck. Could, Frank agreed, if I don't know what I'm doing. Let me tell you about the next 90 minutes, because that's when everyone on the construction site stopped working and just watched. Frank climbed onto the back of the homes and began hand-cranking the winch. Slow, methodical, the old reduction gears clicked with each rotation. The cable began to take up slack, running through the pulley system to the chain. The chain went taut. The home squatted on its rear suspension. The old Dodge frame groaned. For 10 minutes, nothing visible happened. Frank just kept cranking, building tension in the system, loading the pulleys, testing the angles. Then he stopped. He climbed down, walked the entire length of the chain, checking each connection point, each snatch block. He adjusted 2 of them slightly, walked back, climbed onto the homes, and pulled the brake release. The shock was instantaneous. The chain didn't snap, it jumped. The sudden release of stored tension created a whip-crack effect that ran the entire length of the system. The excavator shuddered. The mud around it boiled. The excavator moved. Not much, maybe 6 inches forward, but it moved. The construction crew erupted in shouts. David stood with his mouth open. Marcus took off his hard hat and wiped his forehead. Frank reset the system and cranked again. This time he built even more tension. The home's frame was visibly flexing. The old tires were compressed almost flat. The boom was bending at angles that made Marcus nervous. Frank released the brake again. The excavator moved another foot. And another. And suddenly the suction broke with a sound like a giant gasp. The excavator lurched forward, free of the mud that had held it for 3 days, rolling on its tracks like it had just woken up. Frank kept cranking. Slow, steady, no drama, just the rhythmic click of the reduction gears as that 47-year-old wrecker pulled a $450,000 excavator across 50 feet of river mud and onto solid ground. When the excavator was safe, Frank set the brake, shut down the homes, and climbed off. The construction site was silent for about 3 seconds. Then everyone started clapping. Marcus Webb walked over to where Frank was coiling the chain and stood there for a long moment. "I don't understand," Marcus said finally. "We had $200,000 worth of modern recovery equipment, computer-controlled winches, hydraulic everything, and they couldn't do what a wrecker from 1949 just did." Frank finished coiling the chain before he answered. "Your modern equipment is designed to protect itself," Frank said. "Sensors, computers, automatic shutoffs, all of that is good for normal recoveries, keeps operators safe, prevents equipment damage, but it also means those machines won't do things their computers think are dangerous. They'll pull up to a limit and stop." He patted the homes. This old girl doesn't have a computer, doesn't know when to quit. She'll pull until something breaks or the job gets done. The trick is knowing which happens first. How did you know? 48 years of doing this, Frank said. I've pulled things out of mud, ice, water, ditches, ravines. You learn what works. Steady pull doesn't break suction. Shock load does. Modern hydraulics can't generate shock load. Manual systems can. It's not about how strong your equipment is. It's about applying force the right way. David walked up, still holding his calculator. Mr. Kowalski, I owe you an apology. I told you the physics didn't work. Physics worked fine, Frank said. You just calculated the wrong physics. You calculated steady-state pulling force. I used impulse mechanics. Different problem. David looked at his calculator like it had betrayed him. Marcus pulled out his checkbook. What do I owe you? Nothing, Frank said. I can't. You just saved us $500,000 and 3 weeks of schedule. I have to pay you something. Frank thought about it. You got a county historical society around here. Yeah, Clayton County Historical Museum. Give them $5,000. They're trying to preserve old equipment, machines like this. Tell them it's from the Excavator rescue. Marcus wrote the check on the spot. Then he asked Frank a question that had been bothering him. Why did you come? You're retired. You heard about this on the scanner. You didn't have to help. Frank looked at the homes, at the old wrecker that had pulled its last vehicle for him in 1994, that he'd kept running out of respect for what it represented. I came because I heard your engineers say it was impossible, and I've lived long enough to know that when someone says something is impossible, they usually mean they don't know how to do it. There's a difference. He climbed into his old Ford F600 and started the engine. You've got good people here, Mr. Webb, but don't let them forget that the old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for the problems the new ways can't solve. Let me tell you what happened after, because the story doesn't end with the excavator on dry ground. Word spread fast. By that evening, the story of the 1949 homes pulling out a modern excavator was on the local news. By the next morning, it was in the Des Moines Register. Within a week, Frank had received calls from 3 construction companies, 2 recovery services, and a museum in Tennessee asking if he'd consider donating the homes. He politely declined everything. The homes stayed in his barn, started once a month, taken to shows twice a year. Marcus Webb finished his bridge project on time and under budget. He kept a photo of the homes pulling the excavator in his office for the rest of his career. And every time a young engineer told him something was impossible, he showed them the photo and told them Frank's story. David Chen went back to Iowa State and wrote a graduate paper on impulse mechanics in vehicle recovery. His professors thought it was theoretical until he showed them the photos. The paper won an award. The Clayton County Historical Museum used the $5,000 to build a shed for vintage recovery equipment. The first piece they acquired was a 1952 Holmes wrecker, donated by a retired operator in Dubuque who'd heard Frank's story and wanted to preserve the legacy. Frank Kowalski died in 2004 at the age of 79. The 1949 Holmes 440 wrecker went to his grandson, Tom, who still operates it at vintage equipment shows across Iowa. The wrecker has pulled exactly 1 vehicle since the excavator rescue in 1996. In 2001, a county sheriff's department cruiser slid off an icy road into a ravine that modern recovery trucks couldn't access. Tom Kowalski fired up the Holmes, rigged the old manual winch, and pulled it out just like his grandfather had taught him. The excavator that everyone said couldn't be moved, still running, still on the same construction company's equipment roster. Marcus Webb insisted they keep it as a reminder. And somewhere in a barn in Cedar Rapids, there's an old Ford F600 with a Holmes 440 on the back. The paint is faded. The boom shows its age. The manual winch hasn't changed since 1949. But when people ask Tom Kowalski why he keeps maintaining a 75-year-old wrecker in an age of computerized hydraulics and automated systems, he tells them what his grandfather told Marcus Webb that September afternoon. The old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for the problems the new ways can't solve. The engineers said nothing could pull it out. They were experts with degrees and computers and modern equipment. They were wrong. Sometimes the answer isn't newer. Sometimes the answer is a 71-year-old man who understands that shock load beats steady pull, that chain beats cable, and that a wrecker built when Harry Truman was president can still teach million-dollar machines how to work. The excavator is running, the Holmes is waiting, and the next time someone says something is impossible, someone in Iowa might just fire up a 1949 wrecker and prove them wrong.